right, you've seen from the title that this is a new look at Southwestern archaeology that essentially sets aside the ceremonial and ritual functions of some of their structures, something that we can't be sure of, and defines it in farming and agricultural economic terms, and that in reality, this will take a while to get through because it's a large and complex topic. But essentially, the round underground rooms known to people familiar with the ancient Southwest are corn bins. There's a difference between a bin, which is used for kernel corn, a corn crib, which is used for corn on the cob. So let's get started. And what we're talking about are kivas, these round underground rooms, and before that, the much shallower, much smaller pit houses. We'll go into the exact details, but the evolution between the earliest pit houses around 300 AD, perhaps earlier, evolves by the 700s and 800s into a larger, deeper, stone-lined kiva or proto-kiva. And then it gets even deeper, and the ventilator shaft becomes vertical by 800 or 900. In the beginning of the thousands, about 1030 AD or later, there were the introduction of great kivas, which were huge kivas. Most of these kivas were 12 to 15 feet in diameter. Basic kiva is considered to be less than 33 feet across or 10 meters. And great kivas are much larger and generally, well, over 10 meters, 33 feet. Some are 51, 54 feet, 64 feet, and there's one that's recorded as being 81 feet in diameter. This is a whole different ball game. Still has all the same functional and architectural and engineering features of the earlier kiva, proto-kiva, and pit house. But there's a change that we're going to look at and see if we can figure out what the real difference is and the function for it. Over the last 150 years, Southwestern archaeology has garnered a huge amount of information about inhabitants and the cultures of the ancient Southwest. And it seemed to have had a serious bent towards religious and ceremonial interpretations for their structures. We're going to take a little bit more of a pragmatic look. We're going to see where the ceremonial attribution comes from and how that it has remained essentially unchallenged for over 100 years. So we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping. This is a sort of a long talk. I wanted to break it into separate sections, probably 5 or 6, depending on how it turns out in the future. We're going to start with a basic introduction of what a kiva is, what it looks like, where they are found, how old they are, sort of the basics, how the kiva got its ceremonial function and who identified it. And in part 2, we'll be talking about the farming practices. And in sort of part 3, we'll be talking about modern parallels. Now, the reason these were identified as ceremonial structures and hasn't been challenged in 100 years is that a farm-sized kernel corn bin did not exist in the United States until roughly the 1960s. And we'll get to the evolution of that and where the change in corn storage practices come from. So, in this part 1, we're going to talk about basic architectural features, predecessor of the pit house, how it was named, and a general overview of the state or current situation that's confounded archaeologists for many decades and still has not coalesced into a clear picture of these ancient cultures. To begin, I feel it's necessary to briefly establish my credentials. In part 2, I will probably bore you, or at least I hope it'll be slightly entertaining. I think it's important that you know the breadth of my experiences so that I can lend some credibility to my argument. My name is Robert Adams. I grew up in Minnesota, graduated from the University of Minnesota with an earth sciences degree, general sciences degree, with a secondary education teaching certificate, and a minor in geology. I went to graduate school at Texas A&M in the fall of '78, and we'll talk more details on the time I spent there and some of my experiences in part 2. But in general, doing both underwater archaeology and terrestrial archaeology as a contract archaeology and owning my own firm. Over a 28-year period of time, I worked in 7 countries and 15 states for a total of 27 years. Now, at age 70, after 27 years of research and first publishing in 2001, I haven't gained much traction on this finding. And so I've decided to commit it to a YouTube video. I'm going to include as many references and credits as possible. I apologize for any of those photos and quotations that are not clearly specified. We're still doing a little bit of introduction here, part 2. I'm going to give you a more in-depth biography, maybe a little long, but I think it's important, and hopefully you'll find it mildly entertaining. So, for those of you who are not familiar with the ancient Southwest, if you're a Southwest archaeologist, I apologize, but there may be other viewers. What we're talking about is the ancient cultures of what they call the Four Corners area of Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. If you take a look, several different individual cultural groups, and sort of as a layman's term, they refer to this ancient culture as the Anasazi. I will try not to refer to that in general, and I don't think the specifics and changes within cultural groups be of much value when discussing these structures because they're all very similar. A majority of these sites that are found, and the number of sites number perhaps 100,000 or more, not including the unrecorded or undiscovered sites on Native American lands. Archaeology and the discovery of these ruins began in the late 1800s. John Wesley Powell, the famed Grand Canyon explorer, noted these and called them Kivas after the Hopi word, and probably with identification by Hopi Indians, because these ancient round underground structures are almost identical as the current historic and religious structures used today. In the early 1900s, by 1890, the largest known site in the Southwest in Chaco Canyon, there are 7 major sites. These sites are referred to as great houses. Now, there's not a specific term or a number, but generally it has 10s or 20s of kivas, 60 or 100 rooms or more. It's a giant aggregation, and they're referred to as great houses. The largest of these, Pueblo Bonito, was first explored with the Smithsonian and National Geographic in the 1890s. The Hyde expedition under the direction of George Pepper, and was later intensively explored by I'm drawing a blank on that, Neil Judd, from 1921 to 1927. George Pepper published his findings, and it's been reprinted by the efforts of David Stewart, sort of his journal and findings or final report, which is not only fascinating but very informative. So most of these sites are not gigantic. Not hundreds, tens of thousands, let's say, are very small. They have 6 square rooms and 1 pit house or kiva. Now, this tiny relationship was first noted by Mitchell Pruden in the 19 teens, and the term has been since classified as a Pruden unit. And it's important to understand that there was a ratio determined between the square rooms and the pit house or kiva at 1 kiva per 6 rooms, or 1 to 6. Stephen Lexon has argued it may have been a smaller number at 1 to 5. Some of these sites are 2 kivas and 12 rooms with the 6-to-1 ratio. As time progresses, from the 400s or 500s AD up through the absolute fluorescence in the Chaco Canyon, these massive structures being built, and all of it comes to a crashing halt at right about 1300. There's some varying dates for the Great Drought, but essentially 1266 to 1299. No more great kivas were built after 1300 or 1325, and this coincides directly with the rise of the Kachina or Katsina religion, which is still practiced today. Now, we'll discuss in part to that there's an evolution from archaeologists that have deemed the early pit houses, because of the artifact assemblage, as a domicile related to the 6-room ratio. And then these pit houses grow in size over hundreds and hundreds of years. And somewhere there's a transition to what archaeologists refer to kivas as ceremonial structures. This is something I dispute. And then the great kivas is another ball of wax, same features, but just massive in size. And we'll take a closer look at that in the future. So that's enough background. Let's begin with what is a kiva. It's defined in general as an archetype or an example. It's round, underground room. It has a bench circling the perimeter, if you look at the slide that's on the screen. And it has 3 known components: a fire pit, a deflector, and a vertical shaft that goes up the side of the kiva. It is known that when this fire pit has hot coals or a small fire, probably hot coals, the air that exits through the roof of the kiva functions to draw air down the ventilator shaft. The deflector is put in place between the ventilator air coming in and the fire pit so that it doesn't fan the flames of the fire pit and burn the entire structure down. We'll talk about that and the possible true or realistic function for the floor vaults that are always accompanied in most kivas and in great kivas, one on each side of the fire pit. So we know there's no question that this ventilator system and how it functions, these are generally in smaller kivas, 12, 15, 20, 25 feet across, and that there's a bench in all of them. Now, if you look at the photos of Pueblo Bonito, these are the photos I took many years ago, you'll see that there are log beams resting on this bench, protruding from the wall, and we're not sure when or how, but it looks like they were axed or chopped off at the edge of the bench. Well, it's obvious you can't chop on top of the bench because you can't cut from underneath, but it indicates that there's salvage. My background in underwater archaeology, when you look at a ship or a hull and you're looking for deck supports, we have a problem underwater. Anything that isn't covered by silt in an anaerobic environment, at least in the New World, and specifically, they have teredo rooms, worms that eat all of these timbers, so you have to extrapolate. I have a background in building, which we'll talk about later in this discussion, but there's a fourth component, or I should say a fifth component, that we need to discuss that indicates that there is a floor at the level of the bench. This floor is critical, and it is what makes the structure function. Not many examples are well preserved, although wood can be well preserved. But when wood timbers and remains are covered with sand, silt, or moisture, many of these timbers rot. And because of the scarcity of timbers, they were extremely valuable and were probably salvaged at a very high percentage. So let's jump back just for a second and see how we get to the identification of kivas as ceremonial. Jesse Fuchs, an excavator at Mesa Verde, had Hopi workers, to remove dirt and sediment, not grad students as the current practice. And he asked the Hopi workers, because they were familiar with their current religious structures, and identified these as ceremonial structures. In 1891, Victor Mendeleev, who was an ethnographer, and several thereafter, asked local Indian tribes to find each of the components and their religious significance. And at the first Pecos conference convened by Alfred Kidder in 1927, a kiva is a chamber specially constructed for ceremonial purposes. Now, in the intervening from 1927, about 100 years, we've learned about dendrochronology, periodic droughts, all kinds of things going on. And it's gotten to the point where the ceremonial uh, interpretation still is the go-to definition, although often they will refer to it as uh, a special room, possibly religious, secular, or other function, and then generally default back to a ceremonial or ritual connotation. Uh, One of the definitions, this is a current one from Wikipedia, it says, when designating an ancient room as a kiva, archaeologists make assumptions about the room's original function and how those functions may be similar or differ from kivas used in modern practice. Well, I can tell you it is my clear understanding that these pre-system collapse, pre-drought at 1300, were for the use of storage of kernel corn. We'll talk in depth about the requirements for corn storage here shortly, but let's go back to the missing element. We've got our bench, we've got our beams going across it, and we also know that during the construction of the 7 major great houses in Chaco Canyon, that between, depending on which reference you look at, 240 to 275,000 trees were harvested in the use of construction for roofs, doorways, etc., in the great houses in Chaco Canyon, with timbers being their origins being identified as being 70 to 75 kilometers away. That 70 kilometers is 46.6 miles. If you're going to carry an 8-inch timber that's 12 feet long, that's its scarcity, and the cost of transportation makes it a very valuable timber. So we don't find a huge amount of preserved wood, at least at this level. The 2 examples that I'm talking about, one of them is this aerial photo of Chimney Rock. It's east of Durango and sort of in Colorado between Durango and Pagosa Springs. It's way up on a ridge top, very difficult, expensive to be hauling timbers, etc. It was excavated by Gene Cohn and Frank Roberts. Frank Roberts published in 1922. And his intriguing argument, you'll see a picture or a drawing from Roberts that shows timbers at the level of the bench covered with smaller, what they refer to as latias, which are 2 to 3 inch diameter sticks, sort of a herringbone pattern. And the covering may be of a plaster, but probably was a reed matting originally. The important quote here is by Roberts, and I will read it. At a point 2 feet 10 inches from the top of the banquette, or the bench, was found a fine floor of adobe. That's the bottom of the kiva. Resting upon this floor were roof beams. When measured and fitted to the remains of the roof beams, piercing the wall at the top of the banquette or bench, here we encountered the first puzzle of the kiva. If these beams were the remains of those piercing the wall at the top of the bench, and there is no reason to doubt this, what was the floor doing only 2 feet 10 inches below it? That it was a floor was established as we found 3 storage boxes, well-defined fireplace in situ, besides the usual adobe floor material. This is a preserved example of the timbers resting on the bench that support a floor. And these are often recorded as roof remains. Well, that's a pretty low roof at 2 foot 10 inches. So there's another example in at the Great Kiva at Aztec by Huddleston. Quote, roofing remains were found in the northwestern quadrant of the Kiva. Huddleston, Personal Communication. Broken sections of large vigas extended radially from the outer wall towards the center. Some lay across the bench, others were in the fill on the floor. Huddleston believed that the vigas extending from the wall to the central square were spaced 3 to 5 feet apart at the wall. Vivian and Writer, 1960, page 42. Now, if you don't have this floor, and in smaller kivas, they may have been placed on the bench, some of them at Chaco Canyon, San Juan Basin, they're embedded into the walls. Some of the smaller structures may have been loosely fitted so they could be easily removed. But that's the fifth element that makes the Kiva function. And we'll show the modern parallels here in just a moment. I think that that squares away pretty much the distribution, the numbers, uh, uh, what Kivas were actually looking like, and how the ventilator worked. Now, I'll dispel this just briefly before this end part. They say that Kivas were built underground because they're thermally efficient. That one always rankles me. You know, why would you make all the effort, build a thermally efficient underground structure, put in a fire pit and a deflector and a ventilator, so that in the winter you can draw cold air down, and in the summer you can draw hot air down? We know it works that way, and that's not what it's used for. All right, in part two, we're going to go over some basic elements, a little background, where we stand for our understanding of Kivas, and the research questions to be asked, and why things don't fit. And in part three, we'll go into farming, and we'll probably start with modern farming practices and how it evolved from the 1900s to where we are today, and discuss the difference in ratios from the one kiva to 6 square rooms in a quote room block, and how it increases over time to 1 to 10 and then 1 to 12. And then after the system collapse, no great kiva is being built. The ratio goes from 1 kiva to 60 to 90 rooms in a room block. All right, that's the end of part one. Thank you very much, and stay tuned for 2 or 3 more parts so you can get the whole picture of what I'm talking about. Thank you.